Following video is intended for the agents and staff of Luxury Homes International. If you're a licensee with another firm and happen to be seeing this video, please check with your principal broker and legal representatives for your company's business practices, policies, and procedures. Everybody, thank you very much once again for making the time to be here today. We're going to go over some of the NAR policies in recap in summary format and go through some of the documentation, as well as we're going to look at some of the simple scripting. And this is really just going to be a recap the past 5 webinars that we've done, just to get everybody up to speed and ready to go. And just a quick disclaimer in case someone is not with our company and they're watching this, nothing that I say today should be considered legal advice. And if you are a licensee, please check with your principal broker and legal representatives for your company's policies and procedures. I want to just give all of you a big congratulations and kudos. Since the NAR policies went into effect on the 17th, and the documents were released on the 12th. Been receiving calls from all kinds of brokers, agents across the state that apparently were ill prepared for this moment, didn't really understand exactly what's happening and how to use the paperwork and how to deal with the clients. Since the 12th, when everything released, and since the 17th, it's been smooth sailing with all of you. So thank you for being so well informed and staying on it. We probably have brought in over a dozen buyer rep contracts. We've done maybe half a dozen new listings, probably half a dozen new escrows that have gone in, and everything so far has been seamless and flawless. So I thank all of you for making the commitment and the time to be informed. So we're going to look at a recap of some of the policy changes, and then we're going to look at some simple scripting for the buyers and the sellers, and then completing the purchase contract. And this is all going to be just summary fashion of things that we have covered already, a couple new things, but it's just to kind of wrap it all up on this last webinar related to the NAR documents. So the policy changes, I think you are all well aware of these. No offer of buyer broker compensation on MLS. Realtors working with the buyer must have a signed buyer rep contract. The buyer broker cannot receive compensation that exceeds the amount in the buyer's rep contract. No advertising of services as free unless they truly are, and no filtering of listings based on compensation amount. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the buyer representation side. The guys that we don't want to hear from are these guys, the plaintiff's attorneys. So if any of these things are violated, these are the people that are out there looking. Although MLS is officially in charge of enforcing, the real enforcement is going to come from the attorney. So I know all of you have been great, but let's make sure that we don't have any little crack in our armament as we go forward and make sure we're practicing in the proper way. And we used this analogy earlier, the plumber, just having all the tools available. I think what I have experienced myself and what you're experiencing out there, the buyers and the sellers really aren't that in tune to what's happening, but we want to, or I shouldn't say in tune, they're in tune, but really don't care that much. But we want to have all the tools. So if it's a simple transaction, great. But if there's more detail, then we want to have all of those arrows in your quiver. And that's what we're going to look at, the scripting. And this is what I'm just referring to. And as I speak to a lot of you, you seem to be having this same reaction from a lot of clients. I know there's been some exceptions to that as well, but for the most part, it's kind of like business as usual. And the bottom line for both the buyer and seller is like, what's my net? Like, what do I do? What is my net? From a seller, how much am I going to make? The buyer, how much do I have to pay? What's going to happen here? And that's what we need to continue to focus in on. And we know this. Every human being on planet Earth listens to one radio station the majority of the time, which is WIIFM. What's in it for me? And as we talk to our clients and help them, we have to always be focused on that. What's the benefit to them? And we'll look at some language that we can use. We looked at this before, the 15-second elevator explanation. I think I've said this 25 times since last week. People asking me, what's going on? What's happening? I heard this is going on with real estate. I heard that the best one I heard was I heard that the government now pays all the commissions that sellers and buyers don't pay any. That was a good one. But anyway, all of the questions that I've received, I'm using this very simple script. I'm saying, actually, you know what? Not much has changed. Probably the biggest thing is buyers now need to sign a buyer's rep contract. Our firm's been doing that for years, so it's really not a big deal for us. Why? Are you thinking of buying or selling something? That's worked for 99% of the people, and they go, oh, yeah, that's what I thought. And then they go on with whatever the next thing. If you want something a little bit longer, I've got the 30-second one. And there's been some friends that have been a little more curious, or they've had some very detailed things. I had this happen to me yesterday at lunch. Someone told me they read this article and then this other article. So I said, oh, tell me what you heard. And as he started to tell me, I realized it was a lot of the misinformation that's out there. So I said, yes, you know what? I've heard that too. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation in the news. The reality is not much is changing. Probably the biggest thing is buyers need to sign buyer rep contract. We've been doing that for years. It's not really a big thing for us, for our company. And there's some changes in paperwork and procedure, but really that's about it. I said, wow, you thinking of buying or selling? That's the longest explanation. And those two have sufficed for 99% of the people that have asked me about the NAR policy changes. And I just want to look at these two compensation structures. We've looked at all of these in the past. And again, this is the kind of the summary wrap up of all of our past webinars related to NAR policy changes and the documents. So if you've missed any of those, please go back and look at it. But these were two of the compensation structures that we looked at before, and I want to revisit it, and I'll tell you why. So this is our familiar buyer, seller, seller's agent, and buyer's agent. From the seller side, they just want to know, what's my net? How much money am I going to make at the end of the day? And the buyer, what's my net cost, right? What do I have to spend? That's really all that they care about. And when we look at the cooperating broker model, which is what we've traditionally been using in the past, the way that the funds transfer, the buyer is the only one who typically brings any money to the transaction. We can say the buyer and the lender, but the buyer transfers the funds to the seller. The seller would then transfer a portion of the buyer's funds to his seller's agent, and then that seller's agent would transfer some of the buyer's money. It went through the seller to the seller's agent to the buyer's agent. That's the cooperating broker model, right, that we've been so used to. But the newer model, and this is what we're practicing as a company right now, and I suspect the industry is probably going to move in this direction. This is the seller pays directly to the buyer's agent. So in this case, the buyer, it's the same funds, right? It's going to the seller. And then rather than routing through the seller's agent, it's just going direct to the buyer's agent and direct to the seller's agent. And when we look at the purchase contract, these are the terms we find in C-4, which we've been using. And then in the listing contract, this is the selection of A-8B, which we have also been using. We're going to look at both of those in just a moment. But I think this is where the industry is going. So in the one model, the cooperating broker model, it flows through the listing agent, then to the buyer's agent. In this one, the seller is paying direct. What's the real big deal about it? Not too much as far as the money or where it's coming from. But this is something that the Department of Justice in particular has been interested in, and they would like to see this model happening. Seller pays directly, or the one in which the buyer pays directly to the buyer's agent. So just be aware of that. This is what we've been doing. You've been flawless with it. I think we'll see the whole industry start to move in that direction. So let's go back and we're going to look at the information about the sellers. Again, this is stuff we covered before. But this is the number of agents that were contacted by a seller before they listed their home. And remember these percentages, they're so high. They're 80 and 90% for one agent that walks in the door. The point here being, if you're an agent and you walk in the door, you've got an 80% chance of getting that listing, even if you're the worst agent that's ever walked in the door. For interviewing 1 to 2, you can see the numbers, and in some of these categories, it's close to 100%. So for all of you, and I think it's what I hear from you, generally, if you're going to go to the listing, you are going to get that listing. But just know that those percentages are so high. Now, the $1 million script, this we looked at before. For the most part, this is what I use at all my listing contracts. So the $1 million script has to be set up in advance. There's a setup with phone calls that are taking place ahead of time. There's emails, there's information that's already been sent to the seller before you show up to that listing appointment. But the $1 million script is just simply, okay, you ready to get started and pull that listing contract out? Just need you to initial here. And if you do the setup correctly, this will work almost every time. The sellers don't want you lingering in their house for an hour to tell you how great they are. Now, some will, some want to go through the whole thing, but I'm just, again, kind of going back to if you set this up properly, they just want to know, what do I do? How much am I going to make? We trust you. That's why we have you here. You have a 98% chance of getting the listing here today. So just get it, go in there, get it, and get it out. Okay, let's look at some of the tools that we're going to add to our quiver. So this is when we're talking to sellers who maybe have an aversion to offering some sort of compensation to a buyer's broker. So let's break it down. What are the advantages to the buyer and the seller paying the buyer's brokerage? Well, the big thing is less cash is needed. You think about a buyer has to pay for the down payment, they have loan fees, they're going to have moving fees, they're going to have furniture they need to buy, there's going to be renovation costs. And in addition, the lenders are going to require them to have at least 6 months in reserves under most loan programs. If the buyer has to come out of pocket with cash, it becomes very difficult, right? And the ability to finance a portion of this, if it's a 20% down and 80% of it is financed, it means 80% of those commissions are being financed, which is an easier thing for a buyer to do rather than coming out of cash. And then finally, it just makes it a lot easier. It's just ease of purchase. And we know if something's easy to buy, we're willing to pay more for it. We use the analogy all the time of an automobile dealership. We all know we could buy the car for less if we bought it on the open market, but it's so easy to go into the dealer and we do it and we pay more money because the process is easier. So what's advantage to the seller, right? This is the person that might be objecting to this. Well, the big advantage is, number one, it's going to have the risk mitigation component, which is big for all of us. And honestly, it's more likely to close. If you're representing a buyer, you get them through all those rough patches, you put a lot of work into that to make that happen. It's also going to increase the pool of buyers because some buyers can't afford to pay an additional amount of cash to their agent, right? And it's going to shorten the time to sell. But the whole thing here is it's going to sell at a higher price because we can sell to more people and ultimately to net more money, which is what the seller really just cares about. So when we look at some of the dialogue, and let me get this thing out of the way. So we're going to look at some of the dialogue here. So this is for the seller, again, that is averse to paying any sort of buyer's rep compensation. So whatever they said, has anyone taken the time to explain the new rules to you? Hey, it's all good news for sellers. So first, let's just look at how broker compensation is paid. In a typical sale, buyer brings all the money, seller doesn't bring anything, right? Yes, okay. Buyer transfers the funds to the seller, and the seller transfers a portion of those funds back to the buyer's broker. So the buyer's brought all the funds. It just flows through the seller into the buyer's broker. And this is still allowed under the new rules. That makes sense, right? Of course it does. Okay. Well, in some cases, the seller may not want to transfer funds back to the buyer's broker. In that case, the buyer has to come up with additional cash. And this can create a big disadvantage for the seller that may result in lower net proceeds. So let me explain. Buyers often use most of their cash to purchase a property. They have all sorts of cash outlays, including loan fees. They've got to do moving. They've got renovation. They're going to buy furniture. They also need to have cash reserves in the bank. So it could be difficult to have more cash to pay their broker, right? Well, I guess that makes sense. Okay. So by offering the buyer the incentive of the funds pay their broker, increases the pool of buyers, increases potential net sales price, and the more buyers, the higher the price, the more you net. to net the maximum amount is the goal, right? That's what we're here for. Yes, that's what it is. Okay, and look, here's the good news for the sellers. Under the new rules, you'll be paying the lower amount of what's in the buyer's rep contract or what we have offered. Now, there's going to be some sellers out there that are not going to offer compensation. So you offering it is going to create a big advantage because you can sell to more buyers at a higher price, netting more money. You can see how that's a big advantage to you, right? That's the simple script for someone who's giving you a hard time. And I know you'll do this in your own words, but if you memorize the scripts and the construct of it, when it comes out, it'll just free flow the way that you talk and the way that you say something. But I think you get the full concept here. Now, there's going to be some sellers that just absolutely, for whatever reason, they're not going to offer the buyer side. And I understand there's some social media groups that are saying don't pay any kind of commissions to anybody. I know some of you have shared that with me. In those types of situations where you cannot help them to see the advantages of offering a buyer compensation, then we can use the negotiate buyer side, right? So the negotiate is just simply selecting A8C. I'm not offering any compensation, but I am open to it. So you can see the dialogue here, but as you may know, sellers have never been obligated to offer any compensation to buyer's broker. In many cases, it's to the advantage of the seller to offer compensation to increase the pool, to increase the net sales price, to increase the net proceeds. Net proceeds is most important, right? Yes, yes, it is. Okay, so the fee for my service is X%. But I'll suggest, why don't we not predetermine any offer of compensation, but just remain open to negotiate it based on the contract terms and the sales price so that you can net the maximum amount. That makes sense, right? Yes, it does. Okay, great. Let's get started. And then you just have to prep the seller. You're probably going to receive offers that are requesting compensation in the 2.5% range. So just remain open to negotiating it. In between all of us here on this webinar today, if you do receive an offer and they are requesting X% and the seller doesn't want to offer, doesn't want to do it, it probably would be better for the seller to increase the price by that X% and agree to pay that buyer broker compensation. And we just went through all the reasons why. So if you're having the dialogue with your seller, and I think we've taken 2 listings so far where the seller wanted to do this, we have to have that dialogue up front. Just be ready, Mr. Seller. If it comes in and it's too low and you don't want to offer that compensation, let's just increase it by the amount that the buyer is asking for. So that would be my recommendation if you're dealing with those types of sellers. So let's look at some of listing agent best practices. Number one, you've heard me say this a million times, but it is so true. No verbal negotiation, period. Never, 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 ever. I won't go through the war stories. You've heard those so many times, but no verbal negotiation. We're talking about price and terms. This will be a typical question you're going to receive. Hey, what if my buyer submits an offer at $1 million? And we're going to ask for X% in buyer broker compensation. Will your seller accept that? You cannot verbally negotiate. I'm so sorry, but we cannot verbally negotiate on terms. Please just submit the offer and then we can respond in writing. Well, no, my buyer wants to know, otherwise they won't submit it. You know, if we submit it at this price, will you pay? Look, I'm so sorry, but we cannot verbally negotiate. Just submit the offer and we can respond. My experience has been if they don't submit the offer, they were never serious in the beginning. But 100% everybody on this call, no verbal negotiation ever, never, 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 period. Okay. And there's been so many cases of litigation on this matter where the agents verbally negotiated something and it went south. So just don't do it ever. Okay. I think you got it. Okay, you're the listing agent now, and let's say your seller has agreed to some sort of a compensation. Hopefully, we're not doing the cooperating broker model, but we're doing the A8B where it's seller payment directly. If that's the case, such as with our existing listing contracts that were pre-August 17th, With those, have a pre-formatted co-op. So you can have a pre-formatted co-op with the amount that's being offered. If you want, I can sign it in advance and we can have that ready to go. So if someone inquires, hey, is your seller offering anything? You could actually email them at the appropriate time the cooperating broker's firm separate agreement. Now, if it's a new listing, we're not using the cooperating broker document. We're just going to do everything through C4. This only applies to the existing listings that are in there. And then one other thing about that, it cannot be posted in MLS. So do not put pre-formatted co-op into the supplemental documents in MLS. That would be a violation. And then be responsive to any requests that you do receive about compensation. And I highly recommend you email that response. If you get a call from somebody and they say, hey, on your listing at XYZ place, is the seller offering anything? And the seller is. It's A8B, and they're offering X% to a buyer's broker. You can tell them on the phone, yes, send me an email, and I'm going to send you an email back. And then just respond. So it's just in writing. My seller is offering X% to buyer's broker compensation. Please use C4 or whatever might be appropriate. And then finally, what we talked about, prepare the seller for requests of compensation that differ from the listing contract. Let's just say we have a listing contract and we put in 2.5% as a buyer broker compensation amount the seller is willing to pay. And we receive an offer and they're asking for 3%. My recommendation would be just increase the price by that 0.5% rather than counter back on that commission amount because of all the things we just talked about. It's hard for the buyers to have that extra cash available. Okay, and now this is where it gets a little interesting, and this is just finesse. So you're the listing agent, you get a call, hey, I'm going to show your property or I'm going to submit an offer. Just politely, kindly ask, hey, by the way, do you have a buyer's representation contract in place? There's no requirement that they show that to you. There's no requirement that they show it to the seller. In fact, there's no requirement that they have that for you to grant them access, but of course they would be in violation of the settlement agreement. But just ask if they do. If they are less informed and they do not, you could either gently suggest that they figure out what is going on, or you can call me and I'd be happy to have a conversation with them or their broker if they're not the broker. So let's just try to help out our fellow agents out there that are a little less informed. Now, if you are a listing agent and you have just received a purchase contract on your property, when you submit the purchase contract for review to me, please include your listing contract to verify the commission structure and the amount. Okay, so when you send the purchase contract, because it's going to have some, potentially will have some offer of compensation in there, I just want to be able to double check the terms in the listing contract itself. Okay, and then finally, no verbal negotiation. Okay, I think you got that one, but absolutely no verbal negotiation. Okay, let's shift gears and jump over to the buyer side. So again, these were surveys that we went over in detail when we did the buyer webinar, but you can see here 51% of buyers said they actually found the property that they purchased. It wasn't the real estate agent. And when we looked at the 1,000-watt survey, the number one benefit a buyer sees in an agent is risk mitigation and not finding the property. And for a lot of us, we've always led with our greatest asset for you, Mr. Buyer, is finding you the property. But we can see that it's changing, right? With all the websites and all the apps that are out there. So this is just some simple dialogue when you first meet a buyer. You know, my biggest value is not finding you your next home. Really, truly, that is the easy part. And you might even do it before I do. The biggest job that I have and why I'm important is I help you take the next 65 steps and help shield you from the risks and the pitfalls. That's what a real estate agent does. And it's true. And we know when we get into escrow, we're on the buyer's side, all of the little detail that we have to go through and get through. And then this is just a nice one. If you're sitting in open house and somebody comes in and you ask them, are you working with an agent? They say, no, we're just starting to look. Well, the real value of an agent is not finding your next home. Really, that's the easy part. You might even find it today at this open house. Ha 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 ha. The value of a good agent is to help you take the next 65 steps after finding the property and shield you from the risks and the pitfalls. Could I just send you something important terms to consider when you're purchasing? That's just a real simple open house dialogue, and it's 100% true when we're talking to the buyers. This is also from the NAR survey, and this is the number of real estate agents interviewed by a buyer before they selected one. And you can see almost 70% just talked to one or interviewed one, so to speak. And if we look at two, it's 84%. So the chances, if you have that moment and you are going to, quote, be interviewed by a buyer, and in today's world, that's going to accelerate and speed up because you have to have them sign the buyer's rep contract. But just know as you walk in the door, the percentages are very high that they're going to work with you. We went through this last time. I'm not going to go through the whole process. Buyer consultation process and in selling that we use, the greet, qualify, present, and close. And when we talk about demonstrating our value, again, a big thank you to Aaron Lynn for being so generous and sharing his home buyer guide with us. This has been reformatted for your use. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It tells the buyer everything about the process. This is on the toolbox right now. If you have a buyer lead or you're working with someone potentially as a buyer, send them this home buyer guide. It's very impressive, and it's been branded for luxury homes for your use. So again, thanks, Aaron. When we're talking to buyers, we want to show the complexity, but deliver simplicity. Again, this goes back to the pitfalls of buying. Look, buyer, there's all this stuff out there, and it's true, right? There's all these risks and pitfalls. I make it very easy. I am here to guide you through the whole thing. And I also have access to properties that are off market that you'll never see. So show the complexity, deliver the simplicity. And again, this is that same script. My biggest value is not in finding your next home. That's the easy part. You might even do it before I do. My job is to help you with the next 65 steps, blah, 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 and so on. But this is really what we do, right? We show the complexity, but when we're in the transaction, we deliver simplicity. Okay, so here is the simple close on the buyer dialogue after you've done your presentation. And you can hopefully you're going to use the home buyer guide. Based on everything we covered today, do you feel like I can help you secure the right property in a reasonable time frame? Yeah, it seems like that. Okay. So part of my job is to negotiate the best deal for you. And part of that is we're going to ask the sellers to contribute funds, which would cover my X% fee. And the good news is you don't have to pay anything until we're at closing. You're getting your new set of keys. Does that sound good to you? Yeah, it does. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. That's if you've gone through the process, you've demonstrated value, and now you're looking for the close. This is just a nice, simple one at the end, just to get you over the finish line or the start line. Okay. Now this is if the buyer is asking about the NAR settlement. This would be someone who needs a little more detail. And again, this is expanding our toolbox, if you will. Whatever they say to you, oh yeah, tell me what you've heard. Well, has anyone taken the time to explain the new rules? Well, it really is all good news for buyers. Now, all companies across the US, including Hawaii, must enter into a buyer's representation contract. And our company's been using those for years, so it's really not a big deal for us. But one advantage for the buyers is now they know the company truly represents them and has a fiduciary relationship. That means we're looking out for your best interest. That's a good thing, right? Oh, yeah, that's a good thing. Well, the second advantage is the buyer knows exactly how much the buyer's broker is going to be paid. Right? And that's also a good thing. Oh, yeah, that's a good thing. Okay. Well, you're ready to get started and find your new home. Now, if there's a little bit of resistance on paying that fee, so let me explain how we're paid for our fees. First, let's look at how buyer broker compensation has historically been paid. Typical sale, buyer brings all the funds. The seller doesn't contribute anything, right? Yes, that's right. So the buyer transfers the funds to the seller. Then the seller transfers a portion of those funds back to the buyer's broker. The buyers brought all the funds to the purchase. It just flows through the seller and back to the buyer's broker. Does that make sense? Yeah, I guess that does. Okay. Well, in some cases, the seller might not want to transfer any funds back to the buyer's broker. So in that case, buyer, instead of transferring the seller, just transfers to the broker. Same funds, it's just a different route. Does that make sense? Yeah, that makes sense. And then also, Mr. Buyer, in every offer that I prepare, I'm going to ask and negotiate for the seller to pay all of my fee. Now, if the seller only pays a portion or they pay nothing at all, then you pay us directly through escrow. But again, we just looked, it's the same funds. That all makes sense, right? Yeah, I guess it does. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. It's all true, right? It's the same funds. It's just flowing through in a different system. So let's look at some best agent practices on the buyer side. You already know this one. So no verbal negotiation. If you are on the buyer agent side, do not call and say, hey, if we submit an offer at this, will your seller pay that? Don't do it. Just submit the offer based on what the client wants. This is going to be the theme. This is the number one thing for a buyer agent best practice. Submit the purchase contract based on the buyer's criteria, not what the listing agent states or what the seller wants. This is the number one uh, thing to remember if you're working on the buyer side. It doesn't matter what they say is being offered. It doesn't matter what they send you. It doesn't matter what the seller said they want. It doesn't matter what the seller said the bottom line is. Just submit the purchase contract based on the buyer's criteria. Okay. So if the buyer wants the seller to pay X in the compensation or credits, but the listing states only there's only Y available, submit it anyway. And look, just like the other, when we're looking at it from the seller side, if I receive an offer as a seller at $1 million and you're asking for X%, maybe I don't want to pay that. But if I received an offer at 1.1, I gladly pay that, right? That's going to cover, but we don't know what their numbers are. So let's not try to guess. Additionally, if I'm a seller and I finally got an offer in on my property, they're asking for 0.5% more or 2.5% more than I was going to offer, maybe I'd still take it. Or maybe I'm going to negotiate a little bit on the price. But main driver here, submit the purchase contract based on your buyer's criteria, not anything at all to do with what you've learned or what they've sent you in writing or what they say to you. No steering. Okay, this has actually been an NAR policy for a long time, but now it's serious because it's part of the settlement agreement. So you as an agent must show all properties regardless of any compensation being offered or concessions being offered. This is why it's better if we don't even know if there's compensation being offered. If you're going to go show 5 properties tomorrow, don't waste your time calling each agent to find out if they're offering compensation. Don't do it. Just go show the properties, and if your client likes the property, submit it based on what your client wants. Now, if the buyer is giving you resistance and saying, look, I'm a VA guy, I don't have any more money. So if they're not going to pay, I don't even want to see the property. Just tell them, let's see the property anyway. We can submit an offer based on what you want to do, and then let me try to go and negotiate the terms that you want. And like we just talked about, there's a high probability, even though the seller and the seller's agent said, we're not paying a thing, if the price and the terms are right, they are going to pay that. So this is the main driver for us on the showing side. Really, it's better if you don't even know what the compensation being offered is. That way you could never be accused of steering. And you're not going to give bad information to your buyer. And I'm going to give you an example. This is a real live example that ended up in pretty heavy duty litigation. A buyer told their buyer's agent, I like this house, but I'll put an offer in only if the seller will accept, and I'm going to make up these numbers, $1 million. Okay, so the buyer instructed the buyer's agent, find out if the seller will accept $1 million. And if they will, I'll put an offer in on the property. The property is listed at 1.1. Buyer's agent called the seller's agent. Hey, I've got my buyer. They will put an offer in. If your seller will sell at $1 million, can you find out? The listing agent said, my seller will not sell at $1 million. We're listed at 1.1. It has to be very close or they're not going to buy it. So the buyer's agent told the buyer, look, this is what the listing agent said to me. They won't sell it for $1 million. They want something close to their asking of 1.1. Fast forward, that property sold and closed for $980,000 to another buyer. The buyer that talked to their agent, who verbally talked to the listing agent, sued all the parties and said, you all lied to me and you colluded. And if I knew it would have sold at 980, I would have put an offer in at 1 million. And that litigation dragged on for a long time. My point here is if the listing agent tells you, no way, this is what we're offering, my seller won't go above it, you don't know that for sure. And someone else might submit an offer and negotiate in the buyer broker compensation. And if your buyer finds out, you're setting yourself up potentially for the threat of litigation. So just submit the offer. Don't worry about what they say they're offering. Okay, just on a buyer agent procedure. So right now, as soon as you have the buyer representation contract in place, email a copy of that to my office because I'm saving that in your files. And you already know this from previously. You have to have that signed before you tour any home with the buyer you're working with. We're using the standard HAR exclusive buyer representation contract. If you have a special need, and I know that some of you do, maybe for a single property buyer rep contract, or if you're going to do just a short term, like a 1 or 2 day, you can also insert that into the existing buyer rep contract. But if you have a special need, you let me know as far as that goes. Now, when we do the purchase contract review, so this is you as a buyer's agent, you're preparing that offer. We're going to select C-4, seller to pay directly to the buyer's broker. We're also going to attach a cooperating brokerage firm separate agreement. Now, these two don't go together, but we're going to add the additional language, which we're going to look at in a moment. So that way it could be done either way, and I'll explain when we get to the paperwork. And then finally, you need to submit to me, along with the purchase contract, your buyer rep contract. I just need to confirm the amounts that are in the documents. Okay, let's look at the paperwork. We're going to shift over into the paperwork, and then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. Okay, the listing contract, and I think everyone knows now, A7, this is the amount that the listing brokerage firm is going to get paid. Right, so this is the full amount that's going to go in there. For example, on this one, I just put in 3%, the purchase price plus GET. This is A-7. Now, A-7B contemplates in advance, what if the buyer is unrepresented, right? They're coming in just as a customer. There's no buyer broker on the other side. We're going to want something additional for that. So we would put in here, let's, as an example, 2% of the purchase price plus GET. So in this case, if the buyer was unrepresented, no buyer's broker, listing brokerage firm is going to make 5%. Then in our A8 compensation to buyer's brokerage firm, we are going to suggest to the sellers that we focus in on A8B. And this is compensation paid directly to the seller in the amount of, so this will, whatever the amount is that the seller and the brokerage firm agree to offer to the buyer, compensation amount. This one will tie directly into C-4. Okay, so this is what we're going to use on our listing contracts going forward if the seller is open to offering buyer compensation. Okay, then on the purchase contract, if we are the ones submitting the purchase contract, we are going to select C-4. So this is seller compensation directly to the buyer's brokerage firm, and we're going to put in whatever that percentage is that's in your buyer's rep contract into C-4. And here I just have X.5% of the purchase price plus GET. Then additionally, I mentioned we're going to attach the co-op. These two don't go together, but we're going to put in the special terms, and you can see the language here. Paragraph C-4 of the purchase contract is further expanded that seller will pay the compensation to buyer's brokerage firm either directly or through the listing brokerage firm. So this way, we don't know what the other side has in their listing contract, whether they're doing an A8B or something else. This way, we are covered either way, and they can counter back to us if that needs to happen. But this will cover it both ways. At the Standard Forms Committee level, we are talking about this, about how to address this right now and the confusion between C4 and the cooperating brokerage firm, which are two separate things that don't go together. But this language, for our purposes, for our company, is going to tie that together right now on the purchase contracts as a gap going forward. Okay. Everybody, thank you for listening to all of that. Any questions about anything at all that relate to the NAR and the documents and the things that we're doing? Okay, so what do you do in the case that you're referring your buyer to an out-of-state brokerage? What compensation do you insert in the buyer rep contract? Okay, so if you are referring a buyer outside of Hawaii to another place, might even be outer island or it might be in California, we would be signing the referral contract between our brokerage firm and their brokerage firm. Has nothing to do with the buyer. So the buyer here is not going to be buying here, so you wouldn't need the buyer's rep contract because you wouldn't be showing them any homes. Typically, in our referral agreements, we ask for a 25% referral. Now, the other party, let's say it's in California, if they're going to go show the buyer, then they're going to have their procedures and policies, but they would also have the buyer's rep contract in place before they could tour any properties. Okay, and if we receive a referral here, let's say California does a referral and sending a buyer to us, as soon as we meet the buyer and start working with them, of course, we would have to sign the buyer's rep contract prior to touring any homes. Okay, any other questions? Again, everybody, I just want to acknowledge and give you credit. I'm so proud and so happy that you have been doing such an awesome job in this transition compared to what I'm seeing from the other companies. You all, especially everybody that's here today and watching this video, you've invested the time, you've taken the time to be at the top of your game. So I really thank you for that. All right, until next time, be well, be kind, happy selling, and aloha. See you all soon. Okay, bye.